The views expressed are solely those of the speaker and not necessarily those of Paltalk.com, AVM software, or its advertisers.
News Talk is online. News Talk Online is a production of Paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet with more than 4 million unique users, on demand on iTunes and on YouTube, and on my blog, GaryBaumgarten.com, where you're encouraged to post your comments, whether you agree with yours truly or not. And thanks to our good friends at CRN Digital Talk Radio, we're syndicated to an additional 12 million households. I am your host, Gary Baumgarten. Welcome to the show. I trust and hope that everybody had a wonderful holiday and are getting ready for another great holiday. But, you know, for some of us, when we're warm and toasty in our homes, enjoying the eggnog or the hottie toddy or the champagne, the little bubbly that we might pop on New Year's Eve when the big ball drops at Times Square, we should take just a moment to think about those who are less fortunate than us. And I'm referring, of course, to the homeless, not only of the United States, but of the world. In researching for today's show, I learned that there are not only 35,000 people in homeless shelters here in New York City, and by the way, that's the greatest number and the greatest number of families in New York City in recent memory. The figures that were compiled by the Coalition for the Homeless were based on actual figures provided from the public record in New York City. I was frankly very dismayed to hear the mayor speak very sarcastically or ironically about those figures, saying that, well, there's certain advocates that are trying to stir the pot, is what he said in essence. We don't have people sleeping on park benches like we used to. Well, Mr. Mayor, you need to look around a little bit more, because I see people sleeping on subway steps and in train stations and on subways, people actually living on the subways. So, yes, when it's cold out, they may not be out in public view on the park benches, but they certainly are on the subways. But what was really interesting, ladies and gentlemen, as I looked at this issue, I found that it is a problem that is being addressed, or there are attempts to address it, elsewhere in both the industrialized and in the developing world. Most notably, I noted that in Canada, the United Kingdom, and most especially in Australia, of all places, there are major initiatives to address the homelessness problems there. And I submit to you that the problem of homelessness is greater than the figures would indicate, because I would not be surprised if the majority of people who are listening or watching this program don't know. It would not surprise me if they did know at least one person, a friend, a relative, an acquaintance who is technically homeless but living with somebody else, but not showing up on the homeless figures. Well, here to help us address the problem of homelessness, bring it to our attention, and help us figure out what public policies are best suited to help homeless people is Lindsey Davis. She is the community organizer at the aforementioned Coalition for the Homeless. In her 4 years at the Coalition, she has focused on research and analysis of New York City housing subsidy programs and policies, as well as advocacy for implementation of best practices in housing offered to homeless individuals and families. She has also worked on efforts to ensure the right to shelter for homeless families and single adults is upheld. Lindsey Davis, welcome to News Talk Online on Paltalk.com.
Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us. Am I right in suggesting that the number of homeless families who are in shelters here in New York City alone has reached unprecedented, unfortunately, historical levels?
Yes. As of November of this year, the city's own data shows that there were 9,720 homeless families sleeping in the New York City shelter system. And That number is the highest number since data has been kept by the city in about 25 years. Altogether, that includes there are over 36,000 people sleeping in the shelter system, 16,000 of which are children.
16,000 of which are children. Now, I'm sorry that I'm repeating some of the comments that you're making here, but I want to make sure, because sometimes when we're talking, figures fly over the head of people because it's hard to absorb them as they're flying by. But that's in New York City alone, 16,000 children in homeless shelters. And would you agree with me, Lindsey Davis, from my assumption, would you agree with my assumption that there are people who are homeless that aren't being counted because they're staying with friends, relatives, and acquaintances?
Definitely. I think, traditionally we refer to, people who are staying with a friend or a relative but do not have a place of their own as essentially doubling up with someone else. And a lot of homeless families try their best when they lose their homes for any number of reasons, including, the current economic downturn. They try their best to use every resource they have available to them before going into the shelter system. And that often includes staying for some short period of time with a friend or a family member, doing anything they can to try not to need to come into shelter because, unfortunately, staying in a shelter is not necessarily the greatest place to be with your family or on your own. And, people try their best to do anything they can to avert that kind of a situation for themselves.
Now, what percentage of here in New York City, and we could talk about the rest of the nation and the world as well as the conversation progresses, of those in the homeless shelters, what percentage of those individuals are in shelters that are run by government agencies, and what percentage in shelters run by private organizations?
In the city of New York, the way the shelters, there is a right to shelter both for homeless families and for single adults that's guaranteed through one sort of something called a consent decree,